Hello, and welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast, where we highlight the integration of psychology and psychological principles into the world of business and organizations. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. All right, so I have a very, very interesting guest for you today. Her name is Dr. Anna Kallschmidt, and I hope I said that right. Right, Anna Kallschmidt, great.
You did.
Anna is an expert on organizational culture and the unwritten rules of work. I love that phrase, the unwritten rules of work. Anna's research has been implemented at global organizations, including the Big Four firms and Ivy League institutions. Anna likes to confront societal fears and cultural taboos head on. Her mission is to pave the way for individuals to embrace vulnerability and harness the power of authenticity in every aspect of their professional journey. Anna, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad that you were able to come on the show and talk to us a little bit about culture. I want to get into that work, but before we do that, I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about your journey, because I know that you've had an interesting journey. And even though you do research related to culture and change, you've also had some interesting experiences, including some of the mistakes that you've made that have informed your work. So tell us about your journey. How did you end up where you are?
Yeah, well, I'm still ending up where I am. Definitely a lifelong learning here. So I'm currently an independent consultant, but I have had several different roles and lived in many different places along the way. So I'm originally from a very small town in North Florida, and I got to go ahead and get this out of the way. People hearing my voice are going to say, she doesn't sound like she's from Florida. So I think we need to clear up something very important, that there are 3 different parts of Florida. Okay. And every Floridian can show you the hand, right? This is Florida. Okay. We have Florida at the bottom, which is northern, South, and Central America.
Okay.
We have Florida in the middle. That's where a lot of schools are and where Disney is. Then we have Florida, which is also known as Floribama, which is up near the top, near Alabama and Georgia.
Okay.
I'm from Florida.
Okay.
Okay.
That explains your accent then.
It explains the accent. It explains my cultural background is very small, rural South. We didn't get Walmart till I was 12. Okay, like small town. I went to my undergrad in Tampa and I did my graduate school in Miami. I have lived in the Washington, D.C. area, which is where I am now, in the San Francisco Bay Area, along with all those places in Florida along the way. And I've been in the federal government. I've worked for local governments. I've done private companies and small consulting firms. I've done a lot of work. So my research was on social class backgrounds and how that influences the work experience during social mobility and even after social mobility. And so I have done projects inside and outside of that for federal, public, private, academic institutions. So I don't know where you want to get started, but I've had different roles and different places.
Yeah, it's really interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking about what you said in terms of the research that you did, in terms of the influence of culture on the workplace and things like that. How do you think your culture and your upbringing, because you brought that up, how do you think that influenced the way in which you perceived all these different places and cultures that you've worked at?
Yeah, so it definitely inspires my work. So something that's funny about culture, I love talking about this with clients of like, what is your culture, right? Because everybody has like the quick answer, the button they hit and they're ready. They're like, oh, I've been waiting for that. Because culture is almost a buzzword now. Oh, we have a culture of ABC. And it's like, okay, sure, maybe. Right? But maybe there are other things that go on into what your culture is and what you say it is. So the funny thing about culture is that we perceive our cultures as normal. We don't perceive them as a culture. We just perceive them as the way things are. And we don't perceive them as a culture until we're in somebody else's culture. And so I have been in the position, which I'm grateful for the past 10 years, of realizing my culture is a culture and it's not just inherently normal. And I think that puts me in a position to be able to talk about things with my clients about, is this just the way business is? Or is this your culture? And it's not all of your employees' culture, so you're running into conflict.
Yeah.
And that's where I coined the term unwritten rules of work when I was working on my dissertation, where I interviewed people from low-income backgrounds who were now in higher-income backgrounds. Were there any unwritten rules in your workplaces as you moved up? And all of them said yes. And I talked to them about what was different and I analyzed how that varied between and within Black and white women. And being aware of those nuances, those unwritten rules, is really critical for understanding what your culture is, but it's very hard to see it when that's all you've been exposed to. So my background, I think, is how I came up with that research question in
Yeah.
the first place, and how I've collected that evidence and been able to communicate with people who are in different cultures about, let's identify what are the assumptions we're making here when we're talking about what is professional or not,
Yeah.
or what is cultural or not.
I love the complexity that you highlighted there, because we're talking about gender, we're talking about race, we're talking about SES, and then we're talking about how all of that impacts the unwritten rules of a workplace, right? And so that all
Yeah.
impacts how you feel and how you behave and how you react in the workplace. Do you have any examples to help illustrate some of the results of that research and how that impacts a person and how they work in the environment?
Yeah, I'm almost immediately clear because a lot of it is communication style.
Mm.
So, for example, something I realized as I got into more white collar environments, as I gained degrees and moved quote unquote up, how direct everybody said I was. Like, everybody was shocked by how quote unquote candid. And I didn't understand. When you asked me a question, I answered it. How, like, was I not supposed to answer the question? I don't understand what's happening
Yeah,
here.
that's normal to you, right? You didn't think that was abnormal. That was
Yeah,
just
like,
that's
if
what
I
you're
didn't
supposed
want
to
to
do.
know, I wouldn't
Yeah.
have asked. But I found in my dissertation, which was very validating for me, almost all my respondents were like, you have to speak around the problem as you move up into higher income environments. They're not actually asking your opinion. They want you to agree with them, right? And that becoming the cultural norm in a different bracket of income of environments, where in working class environments and working class jobs, that's less prevalent. Not saying it's not there, but for example, like if you're working in construction and somebody asks, do you think that wall is going to hold up? They're actually asking you,
Yeah.
right? Like, the wall needs to stay up. But if you're a more white collar environment, somebody's like, oh, what do you think of my idea? Are they really asking you for feedback, or are they looking for validation? Right? And there's nuance there. Sometimes people really are. But if you're not from that culture, it's like, well, I don't know why you asked me if you didn't want me to tell you that I don't think it's going to work out, honey.
So this is really interesting, because what you're highlighting there is the difference and the nuance of culture, not just within an organization, not just within from what the person finds normal, but also the higher you go in an organization, there's a specific cultural expectations or cultural norms. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, it varies by hierarchy. And this is very common among Americans, I think. We forget that there are subcultures. So there's the overall culture, and then there's subculture. So I like to give the example. I'm from Florida. Very different than Miami. In Miami, it's very common to, when you greet somebody, kiss them on the cheek, right? That is part of Latin America's influence. If you go to my hometown and kiss somebody on the cheek, especially a man from another man, they're gonna be like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know you like that.
Okay.
Like, it's gonna be
Yeah.
awkward.
That's
And
more of a taboo there,
within,
right? Yeah.
that's within the same state. Right. So organizations have a similar thing of, like, organizations are set up by, these are our rules and these are institutional policies, and this is the culture we say we have.
Yeah.
But where we run into a lot of conflict at work is that doesn't mean all the subcultures are aware of that, like that, or thrive in it. And usually the overall organizational culture, what I find in my work, is not what's actually happening, right? It's not the culture that's actually enforced. It's the ideal.
Yeah.
So what I normally help people, my clients, do is to get from, let's talk about where you're at now and where you want to be and how that's going to impact all these subcultures in the organization on the way.
Yeah. So let's talk about your work. So I'm really interested to hear about the kind of work that you do and how you help an organization in terms of identifying and improving their culture. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So like I said, culture has been a buzzword. And so one of the big ones, people used to tell me, we're very proud we have XYZ culture. And one of the first questions I'll be like, okay, and where's the evidence for that? That always throws them off. I'm like, that's not a trick question. So for example, one of the big things people like to say is we have a culture of learning, right? Have you heard that?
Yeah.
We have a culture of learning.
Yes.
That's amazing. What is the evidence for the culture of learning? Well, we have all these trainings online, right? Awesome. Do people use them? Not as much as we'd like, right? Are people incentivized to take the time at work to do them?
Yeah.
So I have worked in places, especially in consulting, because you bill by the hour. I was not encouraged to train, right? Because that is not billable time.
Yeah.
So But that place did claim to have a culture of learning.
Hmm.
When do I have time to learn? And then you run, let's say you have time to learn. Let's say they do. No, we schedule in time for people to learn. Is it part of their performance evaluation?
Yeah.
Are they retained for obtaining new knowledge? And even if they do, now here's the really big one. What about when they learn something new? You've made time. And they say, hey, we should try something new. Ooh, how is that going to go over?
Yeah.
Right? Because this is our off the shelf package. This is what we do. That's not our quote unquote way. Now you're bringing in this new idea. Well, that can be what you want it to be or not, but that's not a culture of learning.
Yeah.
So what is your culture then? Right now, your culture is what? Is your culture uniformity? Whether you admit it or not, your culture is what it already is, right?
Yeah.
Like if it is a culture of you don't ask questions and you do what I tell you to, it is a culture of uniformity. And maybe that's what you want,
So this
but
is
not acknowledging it doesn't change that.
so this is really interesting because what you're highlighting here is also it's not just about what you say your culture is, it's about what your environment does to support and encourage those expected behaviors and actions to actually make your culture real.
Yeah, so I should have started with when I train. I do start with, and I have images that I show them right, like what is a culture. Yeah, I'm sure you've probably seen the iceberg, right? The culture iceberg of what's visible at the top and what's at the bottom. I like to start with that image when I'm in workshops. And I'm like, okay, what does this tell me? And the room, the room's telling me what they see. I'm like, great. I hate this image. I hate this image. I don't like it. It's not that it's not useful, but I think it keeps us in a hypocritical state. We think of culture isn't the iceberg. Culture is the water.
Oh.
That's what I try to shift my clients to thinking of, is that culture isn't this distant thing that we're seeing and it's cold and it's far away and it's very obvious. And because I'm a 90s kid, maybe I don't like icebergs because I've seen both of the VHS tapes of the Titanic and that did not go well. Right? So I'm also thinking if culture's an iceberg, you want to stay away from it, right? You
Yeah.
just kind of leave it where it is. That's not culture. Culture is what you're already swimming in. It's the air we breathe. It's your knee-jerk reaction. So no matter how many times you scream from the top of your tower that you're a culture of learning,
Yeah.
if the knee-jerk reaction of your people isn't that we can learn more and we can apply it and we are open to new ideas and innovation, which requires also saying when they don't agree with something or when something could be better or when there's a flaw, that doesn't change the water. Now you just look kind of dumb screaming about how great your water is when maybe your water is kind of nasty and needs a spring cleaning.
I love that perspective. That's an interesting and unique perspective on that image, right? You're right. We typically think of the iceberg and look at the top and the bottom, and that's culture. But you have a very unique perspective on being culture being the water, right? And that's we're all in. That's all we're all swimming in. And I also like that imagery because it's you can't get away from that, right? You're in the water. You can't get away from it.
No, you can realize you need to clean your pool, right? Like you can realize, okay, we need to do something with the filtering system here. And you can realize I'm really not happy in this pond. Maybe I'd be happy somewhere else.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something with like millennial and Gen Z, right? Is one of the top reasons for switching isn't always salary. It's that you weren't happy there.
Yeah.
And that has to do with culture.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about some of the mistakes that you've done and how that informs you and your understanding of culture. Can you share with us some of those mistakes? I think mistakes are great ways for people to learn. So help us.
I do too. Yeah, I'm going to tell a story here. So I apologize if I go on here. So I very intentionally tell people that I'm from a very rural southern town. And that already paints a picture of a stereotype of them for me, right? And I'm here to tell you that while I do have all of my teeth, all the other stereotypes are probably true. And then I started my PhD in 2016, during the 2016 election, in a minority majority city. And my PhD advisor was an open feminist scholar. And my little country bumpkin white self did not know what to do with that. It was because feminism where I'm from is like the other F word. We don't do that. I certainly, as a white person in America, had never not been a part of the majority. And it was very overwhelming, but one of the best experiences of my life to not just hear, but observe the narratives in that time of all of the DACA students being afraid and protesting, right? Which was a very different fear than the fears that were in my hometown at the time, right?
Yeah.
And I don't get into politics with my clients as much as I talk about a lot of us have similar fears, but we miss what the other person's perspective is on it. And so I was exposed to like the big issues at the time, but then as I got more into applied work, so for example, I have always been held to the understanding that you work from, 8 to 6, you show up on time, everything is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, like you don't really get a say in it, right? And that was very different from the cultural environment that I was in Miami, where time's a social construct. That was jarring. And I would really try to force that. And I realized that by doing that, I wasn't respecting the culture. So that's like a smaller example. But then as I moved up, and for example, I ran a national project out at Stanford during COVID. Wasn't planning on it being during COVID, but nobody was. I would just put things on people's calendars because their calendar was open and this was their working hours. That's how it's done, right? That's how I'd always been treated. That's how I expected. And like that wasn't how they did things there.
It
That
wasn't culturally appropriate there.
No, not on that immediate team. Probably not for somebody at my level. I'm sure if I was much higher in the chain, fewer people would question it. And while I was a manager, it was a national project. There were a lot of subcultures involved in that. And having to learn to, even though it's their working hours, ask, right? Which seems like a now in hindsight, duh. But it wasn't a courtesy I'd ever had. And it wasn't even something that I had even questioned or considered a courtesy. Like if somebody would have been like, are you available between 2 and 3 Thursday? I would have thought they were like checking up on me.
Yeah.
I would have thought like, do they not think I'm showing up to work? Right? So like, those little things that matter, those are those like, is that a helpful example or?
Yeah, that's a great example. I love that example, especially because I think it highlights that even in the workplace, the culture that you think is appropriate may not apply in that setting, right? And especially even as you said, if you were at a higher level, that it might be culturally appropriate, but because you were at that level, it wasn't culturally appropriate. I want to ask you,
I was supervising them.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, I mean, if you're not available 2 to 3 on Thursday, where are you?
Right. But even at your level, at that supervisor level, it still wasn't appropriate. Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit about interaction here between human behavior and the creation of a culture, because as you were talking about, doing these things and behaving in a certain way, it occurs to me that as a psychologist, you're an expert in human behavior, right? So talk to us a little bit about how important it is for people to understand and appreciate human behavior and how that helps to set a culture.
So I will answer your question, but I have to caveat that I was recently on a client site and we had like lunch together, right? And they weren't like the direct client, but one of their supervisees was like, I did my undergrad in psychology. And the first thing out of my mouth, because I just don't know when to shut up, was, oh, did your parents freak out? And she goes, yes. And I was like, because what do psychology majors hear all the time? You're never going to have a job. Right. Or you're never going to make any money. And I was like, isn't that ridiculous that it's like, oh, you learned how to interact with humans and how human behavior works. You're never going to be able to find a job.
Yeah.
Right. Like this is such a critical skill set for working together.
Absolutely.
Especially as artificial intelligence can do so many hard skills now, right? Like what sets you apart from the machine is if you know how to work. But to answer your question, so culture is the behaviors that we as a group have agreed on are good or bad. They're what we have agreed, not just what we've agreed to reward, though it is, but is what we've also agreed is normal.
Yes.
Like not doing these is swimming upstream. And like that's what I don't think a lot of organizations, when you really sit and think about it, because we are psychologists, so we sit and we think about this stuff, right? Like we think about, what are we all doing? Is it even working?
Yeah.
Who decided that we do this, right? And that's a different train of thought that people who aren't psychologists, we just kind of accept it. And that's the way it's designed.
Yeah.
That's how culture persists, is that you don't have to think about it until you're in somebody else's water. So that informs all of my work. to be honest, is identifying the behaviors and finding out if they're working. And if not, where does this come from? Because we need to address that source to be able to change it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really strikes me when I talk to people about culture is it's a construct, right? It's a psychological construct,
Yes.
and you can change it. We created it. You can change it, as opposed to a lot of people think it's just the way it is, just the way it has to be, and that is
That's
not
the
true.
way it
Yeah,
is my least favorite phrase.
yeah,
That's the way it is. It's like that. It's not just an unhelpful phrase. It's a cowardly phrase.
true, and it's not true. It's just not
It's
true.
not.
Yeah.
Somebody decided this is the way it is because it benefited them.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean it was bad at the time, though it could have been, but it's not working now. And when it's within your control to change it, have the courage to change it. It does take a lot of work. The average culture change takes about 2 years if you're really going hard at it. That's true. But the irony is it takes so long to change because it takes so long to like everybody to wake up to realizing this is all made up.
When you're talking about change there, I'm thinking about one of the things that I know is big for you is harnessing the power of authenticity, right? And
Yeah.
vulnerability. Talk to us about how that's something that you think is really critical and a really an important tool and skill to leverage when we're talking about culture and change.
Because if you're not being authentic, you're not going to change anything. So it's probably not surprising. I am not a fan of corporate jargon. I think partially an influence of like how social media is everywhere now. And I'm not anti-social media. I'm on social media, but you're afraid to say something wrong because it's going to be there forever. God forbid somebody admit they were wrong, right? It's also part of our overall culture. But if somebody comes to you with a problem and you just hit them with, that's the way it is, or you hit them with some corporate jargon on, let's circle back and see what the value and do or whatever. And I mean, just words that are like, did you even hear what I told you? I told you this specific action happened. It harmed me in this specific way. And you gave me a generic textbook answer that you've copied and pasted and maybe rephrased in ChatGPT a couple times on the last 3 company emails that went out. Have you built any trust when you do that? No. And if you don't tap into your own authenticity, it takes you being aware of your own authenticity to be like, what is my culture? What are my expectations? What am I enforcing that maybe is just normal to me that isn't normal to everyone else? If you're not tapped into your own authenticity, you're not going to be able to recognize how you're impacting other people or how other people are being harmed. And if you're not aware of that as a leader, you're not leading.
Yeah. I can think of at least 4 different levels of culture that you need to be thinking about. You need to be thinking about your own culture that you're bringing to bear. You think about the overall organizational culture that you are trying to reinforce. You think about the team culture at the lower level, and then the culture of the people within that team that you're working with on a day-to-day basis.
And on the different teams.
Different
teams, because there are subcultures in organizations, whether that be an ERG group, which could be based on identity, right? Like the LGBTQ or the Black or women's ERG groups, right? Or it could be level in the organization, as we've talked about, or it could even be the type of work you do. Like we all know the marketers and the engineers are different groups.
Yeah.
They have different social norms. Doesn't mean they can't work together. But when they eat lunch, are they acting the same way? Not necessarily. They have a different set upon agreed rules. And so when you are really high up and you're looking at all these cultures, then it's easy to kind of cop out and be like, this is overwhelming. I can't do this. Because once you realize how many different there are, then it's like, oh my God, there's no way. But I think we have this idea, or I know we have this idea, because this is also my dissertation, that there is one right way to do things. It's a very common in American work culture. There's one right way to do it. We're always going to do it, and that's how we get it done. And it's not working. And as profitable as organizations have been, like I was something like, imagine how much better it would be if people actually wanted to work. Well, imagine if you didn't have a lot of people don't know how much their turnover costs them. A lot of people don't know how much counter work behaviors cost them, or just people not doing their job, not being productive because they're tired. They've been there all day. They haven't had a vacation and they don't like you. Right. And it's easy to look at that and be like, there's no way I can get all these people to do one thing. You're right.
Yeah.
but that's a strength. And that's looking at, are you trying to fit people into your water, or are you trying to develop water that can support a lot of people?
Yeah, take advantage of their
Because
strengths.
that's where innovation and thriving and new ideas and identifying mistakes, from cultural to things like product development, you got to have a fresh set of eyes. That's how you're really going to be successful.
Anna, this has been such an interesting conversation. I really appreciate some of the perspectives that you shared. I mean, some really unique stuff there. So I want to ask, how do people get a hold of you if they want to either take a hold of your services or continue the conversation with you? Because this has really been interesting.
Oh, thank you. So I have a website. It's drkallschmidt.com. I know that's a hard thing to spell, but the domain was available because there aren't any
Nobody
others.
else wanted that?
Nobody wanted drkallschmidt.com. There's not another Dr. Kallschmidt that I know of. I am mostly on LinkedIn. You can also find me. It's just my name, Anna Kallschmidt, PhD. And my website has the few socials I'm on. I'm really only on LinkedIn and Instagram professionally.
Great.
And Instagram is, again, just Dr. Kallschmidt. So I hope you type my name right in this podcast. And then people can just copy and paste. Not to doubt your abilities,
We'll
but
make
it is
sure
a
that we do spell
mouthful.
check. Yeah.
It's a mouthful.
And then, Anna, I always want to ask the experts like yourself on the show, what's a tip or some advice that you can share with us, leaders, organizations, teams around culture?
So I have an infographic that I give people, and it's on the first post of my blog on my website if people want to look at it while they read this. And I call it the What's in the Water infographic. And the first step is analyzing your own culture. And I think if you don't start there, if you don't start looking inward, you're not going to find it. And sometimes it's easier to think about if you think about what was normal to me as a kid, because that's where we learn it. And if you don't really get stuck, then you can start asking people, what are things that I do that quirky to you? And that's where you find, like, I know I have colorful Southern sayings that my friends in Maryland are like, yeah, nobody talks like that. I'm like, we do, just not here. Right. So that's where you can start asking. But you have to build that trust with people and not just put all the work on them. So analyze
Yeah.
yourself first, and then you're going to miss stuff, though. So then you got to be open to
getting that feedback.
Where am I quirky? And that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means maybe it's not the only way.
I love the way that you phrase that in terms of asking yourself, what's normal to me? What are the behaviors that I engage in that are just normal to me? And they come without a second thought, and that's your culture.
Right. What do you not need a manual for? Like, I never had to have a manual tell me to shake hands. I'm an American. I grew up shaking hands. Right. I would need a manual. I did kind of need a manual in Miami when people started kissing me. I was like, what is this? Right. But then you adjust and you realize, okay, I just haven't been exposed to this before. Right. So what do you not need a manual for? It's a good question.
I love the way that you phrase that. Anna, thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. And to our listeners, we hope that you've enjoyed the episode and hope you will join us again next time.